G'day. I've just been looking through one of my favourite books. It's published by the Australian Museum and it's called The Complete Book of Australian Mammals. What the Australian Museum has done is collected photographs of all Australian animals and put them in what they call the Australian Photographic Index. And this is a publication of all our mammals. And looking through the section on kangaroos and their relatives, I'm particularly interested in the smallest of all our rock wallabies. Because when I come to page 222, we see it's called the Warabi, the smallest rock wallaby in Australia. But it's intriguing because there's no photograph. There's only a small description and there's just a blank here. Looking further, we see that the Warabi is found only on the extreme northwest of Western Australia and on some of the adjoining islands. And just looking here, it says the Warabi can be found on the Mitchell Plateau and on Bigge Island, where they may be seen moving swiftly amongst the rocks. And this Bigge Island really intrigues me, so what I'm going to do is mount an expedition, take a boat right up to the Kimberleys and head up the coast. Hopefully we'll reach Bigge Island. We're going to have some pretty incredible adventures, I'm sure, along the way. And I'm going to try and film this animal. And this is very exciting because nobody, as yet, has been able to film the Warabi. So let's now head for the wilds of northwest Australia.
After driving right across Australia, Malcolm reaches the mudflats of Derby. The last of the wet season squalls is making conditions miserable. The long, hazardous sea journey to Bigge Island will begin in the shallow, muddy waters of King Sound, beside the Derby Wharf. It's still the cyclone season, and the weather will have to improve before they head north. The forecast says that the rain should ease, so 900 litres of fuel is loaded for the first leg of the journey. And the boat's launched at high tide, when the water's deep enough to motor out into King Sound. Ahead lie weeks of exploration and unforgettable adventure. Malcolm's mates, Jack Nixon, who grew up in the Kimberley, and Tom Wiggin, a Bardi tribesman, make up the party. By sundown, the weather closes in again, and they seek shelter behind Helpman Island. In the morning, it's still raining, and the day is spent waiting for the storms to abate. It slowly clears, and on the ebbing tide, the pop-eyed mullet mill in the shallows around the boat. Often called jumping mullet, they're hunted incessantly by predators, spending their entire lives in a state of panic. It's impossible to move at low tide. There's literally no water. Malcolm explores the nearby estuary and out from the shoreline sees shimmering activity. He decides to have a closer look and, if possible, film the strange occurrence. Out on the mudflats, it's pretty messy, so on a piece of marine plywood, he sets up a basic camera with a long telephoto lens attached. The mangrove leaves are for camouflage. A swipe of makeup and he's less conspicuous. Satisfied that the camera's operating, he pushes out onto the oozing mud. The huge mud crabs with their powerful nippers are alarmed at the intrusion. At first glance, the mud seems devoid of life, but the powerful lens soon picks up an eerie primeval scene. Mud skippers are emerging from their burrows to scrap and feed. These small amphibious fishes are perfectly adapted for life on the mud. Their fins are modified to form arm-like limbs, allowing them to move over the mudflats in search of small crustaceans. They don't have primitive lungs, as is often suggested, but are able to absorb oxygen by keeping their gills moist. Mud skippers are extremely aggressive, spending much of their time furiously hunting other animals from their territory. As Malcolm leaves the mudflats, he too looks like some prehistoric creature. The weather has cleared and it's time to move on. Every 12 hours, the tide sweeps in over the flats, rising 9 metres or more in a few hours. The initial rush of the water is always spectacular and at times dangerous. People caught far from their boats on the relentlessly rising tide have been drowned by the surging power of the sea. Leaving the brown, muddy expanse of King Sound behind, they travel between the stark, rocky islands of the Buccaneer archipelago. On Coolen Island lies a reminder of the recent cyclonic storms, a wrecked prawn boat. The skipper's waiting for the insurance assessors to reach this isolated region.
This is the runway, Tom?
A short distance from the coast, Tom shows Malcolm a particular tree that he noted years ago when he was hunting in the area. This species was once used extensively for the construction of dugout canoes.
Come around this side, eh?
Dugouts, once so common along the coast, are no longer used, and Tom needs to fill a museum order.
It'll take a few days to cut him out. How many days?
He checks the trunk carefully, making sure that it's solid and not riddled with white ants. He's satisfied that it will make a good canoe. It's a softwood tree, so it won't take long to hollow out. Two days' constant chipping shapes the timber. With the scarcity of tall trees, big dugouts were rare in the Kimberley. In such modest craft, the Aborigines travelled extensively along the coast and out to the islands. Today, these dauntless seafarers have left their tribal islands and their dugout canoes have long since disintegrated. Tom, a pilot on the pearling boats, will collect the canoe during a trip later in the year. Then it will go on public display in Broome.
Very closely.
That all?
Yeah.
Malcolm's anxious now to keep moving while the weather's perfect for boating. The team, pleased that the wet season has finally petered out, travel on calm seas along the colourful cliff-lined Kimberley coast. Fresh fish is the staple diet on all Malcolm's long coastal trips, and the net's set regularly for a feed. Small sharks are a nuisance when they tangle the net. But now they've caught something really big. It's a sawfish. It's still alive, so Tom and Jack work quickly to release it. Belonging to the ray family, these strange creatures can grow to over 7 metres. There have been stories of sawfish cutting men in half with a mighty sideways blow. although the sword is normally used to slash through schools of fish. This one's completely tangled, and the only way to get it out quickly is to sacrifice the net. One swipe of that sword could cause terrible injury. The sawfish survives, but the net's a write-off. Malcolm's dog Jardy spots a crocodile attracted by all the commotion. Crocodiles are the most dangerous predator along the northern coastline, and the men must be on guard constantly. A crocodile might attack at any time. 9 people have died in crocodile attacks in Australia over the past 14 years. After so much travelling, they stopped for several days in a picturesque sheltered bay. It's still oppressively hot after the monsoons, so they set to and quickly build a rough shelter. This type of hut, allowing the air to circulate freely, is the most effective in the sweltering heat. Some rough timber poles and a few branches soon completes the job. At the end of each day, Tom's totally absorbed in his favourite pastime, making boomerangs, to be used during ceremonies and for fighting. Tom's a patient craftsman, gradually whittling the hardwood into shape with a piece of glass. After the loss of their net, Malcolm decides to construct a fish trap using basic local materials. They choose a site at the entrance to a small creek that fills on the high tide. The area is marked out around the gutter at the lowest point on the beach, and saplings are cut from a nearby thicket. The poles are driven deep into the moist sand, forming a V shape with the point facing out to sea. And rocks and grass are wedged in between. The spiky spinifex allows the water to flow back out, trapping the fish. More rocks and mangrove branches form wings on each side of the main trap. The second wing will be extended after the fish have swum up the creek. There's some alarm when the tide rises and the swell breaking in the shallows threatens the construction. At high tide, the trap's almost completely underwater. On the change of tide, more mangroves are added to guide the returning fish into the trap. The men panic the fish back into the creek until the tide drops and the trap's exposed. Fearful of the activity, some species shelter up the creek in the mangroves, and they're easily speared. For a trap to last longer than one tide, it would have to be more substantial than this one, with higher walls of rock. But the men are pleased with their effort. They'll eat well tonight.
They're after good feed, huh?
By sunup the following day, they're already on their way again, travelling north. Hall's Point is a natural phenomenon. The elements have sculpted the sandstone into fantastic pillars of intricate delicacy. On each low tide, it's often too shallow to continue. All along the coast, there are extensive coral reefs. With the tide rising and falling over 9 metres every 6 hours, the water's usually too dirty to see anything below the surface. When Malcolm is able to dive, he finds soft corals of exquisite beauty. Tom combs the shallows, spearing fish. Green turtles enjoy the reef too, browsing on seaweed. It's not unusual to find them trapped as they struggle to reach the edge of the reef on the rapidly dropping tide. If they're caught on a high reef that dries out, they overheat and die before the sea rises again. This one's lucky. It's too heavy to carry, but the thick shell will protect it from injury as Tom and Jack drag it to safety.
You never know what you're going to find out on the reef at low tide. Just in front of me here is a little hawksbill turtle. He's trapped in the pool. There he is. It's a beautiful animal, these. In a lot of places in the world, these hawksbill turtle have been brought to the point of extinction because the shell is very valuable. Years ago, in Australia especially, they used the shell for brooches and ornaments. In many places in the world, they still catch these and cut the shell off and make combs. You can tell it's a hawksbill because it's got this hook all the way around at the back of it here. And of course, the name comes from the hawk-like beak here. You've got to be careful or they bite you. This guy is lucky. A lot of them get caught on the reef up here and they die. They overheat before the tide comes in, but already the tide's starting to come in behind me. And you can see that water, can't you, mate? So we'll just drop him in there and let him head out to sea. He doesn't want to go, he wants to come back to me. Just wants to wait in the pool here a little bit longer till the tide comes up and then he'll be right.
Across the reefs, there are many kinds of shellfish, and there's one sure way to check whether they're edible.
All along the coast of Australia, and especially on these isolated beaches, you often come upon these piles of broken shell. Now this is where the Aboriginal people have broken up the shell to eat it. You can see here a large rock and a smaller one that they've used to pick up the shell and break it open. Now these piles of shells are very interesting because in a survival situation, you can come upon one of these and pick up the various types of shell and have a look at it. Then you can go down into the rock pools or into the mangroves and you can find all these. You've got bivalves and you've got the oyster and you've got a bala shell. And I know this one you can find in the mangroves. So later on, as we're travelling along the coast, we're going to have a look around for some of these shells. And this is very important because if the Aboriginal people have been eating them, you can be guaranteed that they won't be poisonous.
It doesn't take long to locate the same species found in the middens. The first dry season winds whip up a rough chop. So Malcolm decides to shelter for the night in one of the many tidal creeks running deep into the Stony Ranges. Daylight reveals an incredible drop in the water level, and the men have trouble loading their swags and tucker. Jack has spent the night on board, keeping the boat clear of the sheer rocks as the tide dropped.
Tricky one.
The day's fish stew is lowered with extra care.
I'll just try and use a catch them.
Jack cautiously motors out of the chasm. Malcolm, Tom and Jardy walk overland until they're able to board the boat in the inflatable dinghy. Much of this coast is still poorly charted, and Malcolm keeps a constant eye on the echo sounder for shallow reefs. The far northwest is unique. The cliff-locked harbours, the brilliant colours, the countless islands, and the ancient eroded ranges make it one of the truly great wilderness areas of the world. There are no towns and no roads. It's just too rough. The only way to have a close look at this country is by boat, but even then, local knowledge is essential. Before tackling the last leg to Bigge Island, Malcolm heads for Prince Frederick Harbour to explore the rarely visited Roe River. On the rising tide, they motor slowly upstream into the high chasm. Inquisitive crocodiles appear, eyeing off the intruders. As the tide peaks, the waters are still, just for a few minutes. Then, as if a plug has been pulled, the river empties. Only an hour before, the men motored along this stretch of the river. Malcolm and his party are now completely isolated. And with the boat well secured, they'll camp for the night. Something catches Malcolm's attention. The The men and Jardy will sleep high on the rocks, for the crocodiles will return on the rising tide around midnight. At sunup, the tide's out again, and the men hike far up the gorge to where the fresh mountain streams meet the salt. Here, the water teems with fish. Within minutes, they have a feed of mangrove jacks. And Malcolm has a good-sized barramundi. Several days are spent camping, exploring and fishing. This is true wilderness. There are few places in Australia so remote. Malcolm hopes that one day it will be given national park status. Barramundi are often found where the fresh and salt water meet. Then it's out to sea again for the final run to Bigge Island. All along the coast, schools of tuna erupt in spectacular feeding frenzies. Pushing bait fish to the surface where they're quickly snapped up. It's the yearly migration at the end of the wet. Easily caught, tuna is delicious, marinated in soya sauce and eaten raw. Malcolm's planned this journey just after the monsoons, a period of calm before the strong prevailing southeast winds whip up big seas. Ahead lies Bigge Island, just off the mainland. Truly one of the least known and rarely visited islands of Australia. Base camp is under the nearest shady tree. In the morning, they're alarmed to see a big croc, no doubt attracted by the visitors. Casually, it retreats and disappears. Malcolm checks the tracks. It's come right to the top of the beach and into the spinifex. Too close to their camp for comfort. As well as the croc tracks, there's evidence of many other animals. This is a large goanna. And these are the footprints of the northern quoll, often called the native cat. Here is a combination of tracks: a small crocodile, a quoll, and the fine trail of a hermit crab. And for Malcolm, the most interesting of all, signs of the Warabi, the small rock wallaby that he's come so far to see. A native rock rat streaks off. Common on the island, they're rarely seen during the day. These rats are native to Australia and should not be confused with Rattus rattus, the introduced black rat. Bigge Island, some 40 kilometres long, is a fractured mass of sandstone, dissected by deep gullies and broad valleys. A perfect habitat for rock wallabies. Somewhere living within these deep, craggy crevices is the Warabi. From now on, Malcolm will spend most of his time on the island with binoculars and camera, hoping to spot the tiny marsupial. He soon realises that the Warabi must be exceptionally common. There are droppings everywhere. Eventually, he spots it. Just for a second, a Warabi. Not much film, but it's a start. Malcolm perseveres and is soon rewarded with the first movie film of the smallest rock wallaby in Australia. The name Warabi is actually a mispronunciation of an Aborigine saying wallaby. The original people on the island called the animal Munjon. When disturbed, the Warabi twitches nervously and thumps one hind foot to warn the others of impending danger. Occasionally, they've been called brush-tailed rock wallabies, but Warabi is now their accepted name. Pleased with his efforts, Malcolm heads back to camp. Well out from the beach, a huge crocodile waits patiently, in case one of the men should venture too far into the water. With their water and fuel running low, Malcolm will have to leave his search for the Warabis to look for a freshwater spring and pick up the drums of fuel dropped off 2 months earlier on a nearby island. Jowdy, who's been travelling with Malcolm for over 12 years, feels the heat. But she's soon up and away when the men are ready to go. It's obvious why so few boats come this way. The shallow waters are riddled with dangerous rocky outcrops. Several days are spent checking every likely source for signs of water. In one particular bay, there's a deep valley running back into the interior, where the vegetation is more luxuriant. A short walk reveals giant pandanus, usually a sign of seepage. And in a deeply shaded glen, they find a freshwater soak. There are no wallaby tracks nearby, so it would seem that the Warabis can survive on the island without fresh water. Further up the valley, another good find, bush yams. It's an arduous job digging them out, but worth the effort. They are delicious. These yams were once the staple diet for many of the Aborigines. As the men return to their boat, they're tailed by the ever-present crocodile. When Tom spots a mullet, he's oblivious to all danger.
Got him?
An expert with the spear, he rarely misses. Further around the island, they spot fresh tracks. During the night, a female turtle has crawled up the beach to lay her eggs. They're a favoured food for all the coastal tribes, and Tom soon locates the nest. He takes some of the eggs and leaves the rest to hatch. Malcolm's been told that there are cave paintings of particular interest on the western side of the island, so every likely location is checked. Eventually, they spot a wide rock overhang, suitable for a wet season shelter. Inside are unique paintings that seem to record European visitors. The earliest known explorer here was Abel Tasman, who mapped the Kimberley coast in 1644. These paintings may be a record of pipe-smoking sailors carrying containers, probably to collect water. Nearby is a well-preserved painting of a Kyara, a mythological spiritual being who lives in the clouds and controls the weather. The piercing eyes have been engraved into the rock. This is a young Kyara, arriving from the sea on a waterspout. The old Aborigines say that if you annoy a Kyara, it will create strong winds and big seas. The Aborigines have long gone. Only their ochre-painted bones remain, slowly disintegrating in the secluded rock crevices. Tom, a Bardi Aborigine from the islands of King Sound, lends a traditional aspect to the scene as he cuts timber to make his boomerangs. He already has a dozen stored in the boat. Tom's very proud of his skills. He's the best boomerang maker in his tribe. There's no shortage of fish in the shallows. One cast produces a feed of good-sized whiting. Tom whittles the wood into shape with his axe, and later he'll smooth the boomerang off with a sliver of glass. While packing up camp, Malcolm hears a strange commotion coming from the tucker drum. The culprit is a northern quoll. Often called a native cat, it's an aggressive, carnivorous marsupial with strong jaws and a nasty temper. Quolls have exceptional reflexes and can inflict painful injury at lightning speed. While the men search for a good fishing spot, a big manta ray swims slowly by.
When I'm back at home, none of my mates believe me when I talk about all the fish in the waters up here. Look, I've just got myself a bit of a cord, one hook on it, no sinker, no trace. Have a look at the watch, coming up to 4 p.m. Drop it in, see how long it takes to get a fish. And I've got one on already. That's about 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. Then he's back in the water. And the sharks are going to get him. How's that for a fish? Hanging the line.
The warm tropical waters teem with fish. Jack trails a hookless lure and is amazed at the number of trevally desperate to grab at it. Popping across the surface, it looks like a distressed baitfish. The activity attracts sharks. These black-tipped reef sharks are dangerous predators. A trace of blood in the water can trigger off a feeding frenzy. Jack, trying for a fish for tea, loses his catch in seconds. Malcolm feels that he knows the island well now and can recognise where groups of wallabies are more likely to be found. It's time to try filming them with a powerful telephoto lens. He's up at dawn, assembling and checking his gear. The resident crocodile oversees all that's going on with alert anticipation. Just after sunup, the wallabies are still active. Malcolm's in luck. A fully grown wallaby. At the slightest hint of danger, he's gone. They seem to be social animals with family groups living on each rocky outcrop. Like all rock wallabies, they're incredibly agile as they leap across the rocky terrain. Although the Aborigines have always known about the Warabi, it was only scientifically described in 1978, eluding discovery until recently because of its extreme isolation. Back near the camp, there's some excitement. A Warabi's been spotted disappearing under a rock. Malcolm has a permit to capture and film a Warabi on condition that it's released unharmed. Luck's with them as Jack manages to grab the tiny animal. A predator of the Warabi, the wedge-tailed eagle, watches the proceedings with interest.
Well, in this bag is what this trip's all about. We finally caught ourselves a little wallaby, the brush-tailed wallaby. This is the one that Jack and I and Tom caught yesterday. If I can just get her out of the bag, and I know you're all dying to see her. Isn't that the most beautiful little animal? It's already quietened down. It's had a good feed of oats. And you can see how small it is when you compare it to my finger. See the size of the head? This one is about half grown. It's a young female. We've seen quite a lot of males now. They're very hard to get in here, as you can probably guess, amongst all the rocks. This one is a lot quieter already. Still wants to hop away, of course. It's quite amazing, after 200 years, you can come up to a place like Bigge Island and have a look at something like that. Look at the large eyes there. Mainly a nocturnal animal. I don't think she's all that happy being out here in the sun. What about these tiny little claws? See them there? When they hop, they just tuck their little claws into their body. Got a very powerful tail for balance on the rocks. Well, we all had a good look at her. We'll let her go. There we are, little one. You're free again.
The young female, satisfied after her meal, is in no hurry to leave. Bigge Island is still classified as Crown land, but there's now talk of declaring it a nature reserve. Let's hope that the government acts quickly. It's absolutely imperative that wild country like Bigge Island is protected for all time from development and feral animals. We can only imagine what might have happened if cats had ever been introduced onto the island. The journey to Bigge Island has been a rewarding experience, but the prevailing dry southeast winds have now arrived, and the men must get going, for it's a long way back to Derby, pushing against a headwind and rising seas. Jowdy, Malcolm's faithful companion's getting old, and it may be her last trip. Malcolm's quest for adventure will take him to many more remote and inhospitable places. He's already planning a journey into the wilds of central Arnhem Land.